project co-director. Oh, now the recording's going on. So a project co-director and senior researcher at the University of Miami. And, as so many of us on this project, I came to this work from actually practicing community ownership with several organizations in Miami. So the goal of the work that we're talking about today is for it to be informed by practitioners and for practitioners. So can we move over to the next slide? So I'm going to just talk a little bit about what the University of Miami team is doing. And, and then we're going to hear, as Paul mentioned, about some of our other partners or some of the partners on the project as part of the collaborative and what folks are up to. But we'll start with just saying that at its core, the way we approach this project is that community ownership is fundamentally about reconnecting the economy to community. It's a way, and Paul was mentioning earlier that we should acknowledge how this work is grounded historically in struggle. And it's sort of very much along a lineage that, far precedes our lifetimes. But it's a way for residents to have real power, right, over the place that folks call home. So when we talk about community ownership, we're talking about collective forms of owning and governing real estate to keep property affordable and in the hands of community, not those with the deepest pockets. It's also not just one thing, right? And that's part of the dynamism of community ownership in this project, is that community ownership takes so many different forms and so many faces, right? Which is how we're referring to this internally, each shaped by the folks who are working to make this happen and the systems in which they need to navigate, which aren't, as we all know, not necessarily designed for projects like these. That leads us to the puzzle and how it is that we're approaching this and what we're trying to tackle. Go ahead. Sorry, I heard an echo. But our proposal, the way we're looking at this is like, how do these community ownership projects balance this contradiction, right? How do you keep property rooted in community, in the control of community and for the benefit of communities, while operating in, real estate market that is designed to maximize profit, right? So across all of these models that we're going to talk about and that we think about when we think about community ownership, housing co-ops or community land trusts or what have you, regardless of how they're structured and financed, there's a shared tension. And even regardless of ethos to some extent, just each one is trying to make local land and property, each one is trying to take local land and property off of the speculative real estate market, but still having to operate within that market to survive. So our research approach in particular is focused on the relational side of that puzzle or that contradiction. Rather than only looking at the financial and legal structures, we're also looking at the web of relationships that either enable or constrain community ownership. So it's really about how community ownership projects across the country negotiate across these various relationships to obtain the trust and the resources that they need to launch and sustain the work. So it's really how community ownership projects adapt in response to that puzzle that's here on your screen. The question of how communities hold strong, right? In systems not built for them, but that's sort of the animating force, I would say, behind all of this. And each partner you'll hear from today is examining this core challenge from different vantage points, right? Whether it's capital environments, policy environments, narrative strategy, or, practices that community ownership organizations are engaging in. Can we move on to the next slide? So the University of Miami team is in order to understand these relationships that I was talking about, we're looking at community ownership ecosystems in 5 regions across the country. So each region has its own mix, right, of pressures that come from unique local housing market conditions, policy environments, nonprofit sector. And our role is to understand how community ownership organizations are building reliable and durable relationships across these very different sets of conditions, right? We want to understand the shared and unique dynamics across local and regional contexts, what we're calling the different faces of community ownership. So what we have on screen is some of the first sites that we've been already conducting research into. There'll be more to come. The following 2 sites will be more, you'll hear more about that in the coming months once we've confirmed them. But each, as you can see, we're looking at different models in place, as well as very specific place-based puzzles and research foci and questions as well. in Chicago, looking at housing co-ops in Chicago, we want to understand how some of these, new sort of smaller self-organized co-ops survive in such a commoditized housing system, right? And how they establish permanence amid, amid precarity, right? With co-ops that are fundamentally focused on anti-displacement work. In the Twin Cities, looking at different commercial investment cooperatives, we want to understand how this one region generated, as far as we can tell, potentially over 13 commercial community ownership projects, some launched, some underway in under a decade, and how the infrastructure to support this growth, the field infrastructure to support it, came up around these projects. These are dynamics we want to understand and see what we can learn from this. Last but not least here, we've also are interested in community land trust in Richmond, Virginia. And really the question is, how did a large community land trust take shape and grow to hundreds of units in a moderate political environment with no community ownership projects except for one statewide community ownership project in Virginia, and then also go on to develop deep partnerships, not only with a wide array of different partners, but also with the state. And one more slide, please. So we are inviting you, before I pass it on to one of our partners, we're inviting you to, stay in touch with us. This is a very, very much a project that's evolving. It's a living effort, and it's growing almost daily. We'll be sharing updates from the COLA Lab, case studies, tools, new and improved websites with the folks who registered today. So, either you might be hearing from all of us either right before the new year or shortly thereafter. Right now, we have an email address up. This is our email address on the screen. Please use it or share it to get in touch with us directly. But I just want to say we see this as the beginning of an ongoing conversation with the community ownership field, right? One that we hope is going to continue, particularly through the Community Field Notes platform, which you'll hear about a little bit later, and other convenings throughout 2026. And before I pass it off, just a heads up, there's a few other elements of this project that you'll be hearing from us about. There's a community advisory board that's guiding a lot of the work that we're doing, and made up of incredible folks at different vantage points across the community ownership field. There is a collaboration with the Bridgespan Group, who is assessing the feasibility of a financial aggregator that is a new source of generating net new capital for specifically for community ownership projects. And there's an innovation fund, which are subgrants that we are providing to community ownership projects around the country. And applications just closed for that. So we're very excited about it. Thank you all so much. We're super excited to keep sharing this work with you. And now I'm going to pass it to Mariel.
All right, unmute myself. Well, hi, everybody. My name is Mariel Ferredo. I am with The Case Made. We are an organization that uses the foundational work of our CEO and founder, Dr. Tiffany Manuel, to help communities, organizers, people, leaders in this world get really strategic about the justice wins that they need to accomplish. And so we're really excited to be a part of this particular project and help lend some strategy and some case-making framework to this project. So I want to continue to ground ourselves in why are we making the case for community ownership? And so I want to start out by saying, we love the places that we live in. We love our neighborhoods, our community hubs, love our small businesses. I'm pretty sure everyone in this room can name something special about their community. Personally, my vision and what I love about my community, and when I look into the future of possibility, I see this really long table where we're all sitting, sharing a meal, showing up for each other, and finding ways to really invest in our collective well-being and growth. That's why you see a picture of a dinner table in front of you. But right now, I know we're facing growing challenges that really make it feel like our communities are shrinking. Cost of housing has become out of reach for many. Small businesses aren't able to survive the increasingly tough economic environment. Honestly, the cost of living in communities is too damn high. And it can feel like solutions or control over this is out of our hands. But that's why we need to bring to light the opportunity for communities to take back control of land, housing, and commercial spaces. I just love that the University of Miami phrased it that way. And what we're doing as our part of the project is a case into this work to make the best possible case for community ownership and stewardship. Next slide, please. And while all of us on this webinar, I'm pretty sure know that the single best investment we can make right now is in creating and amplifying more community ownership and stewardship, we also know, and through our listening at the case made that we've done so far, that community ownership sometimes runs counter to many of America's most ingrained dominant narratives. Here are some of the ones that we actually heard. These are quotes from some of the listening sessions, and they root around these really strongly rooted narratives around individualism, capitalism, who deserves what do we talk about when we're talking about financial assets and ownerships? And we need to really figure out what we can do about that. We have to address the things that really backfire when we start having these conversations and making the case. And these backfires really keep communities and stakeholders unable to see the ways that ownerships can be a path to abundance. Next slide, please. So what we have to do is understand how we can make the best possible case for growing and expanding community ownership models. And you're going to hear more from our amazing partners who are really deep in the research to find those best practices, the policies, financial strategies, as ways to make community ownership a reality. And we are incredibly excited as a case made to walk alongside them. But we also know that the questions and the solutions cannot just be technical. We actually have to understand what's going on in the minds and the hearts of the folks that we actually need on the path to success. And that's why we need case making. We actually need skills to help get folks who are on the sidelines, the folks who have power and influence, the folks who have resources to care about community ownership. And beyond that, to see themselves actually invested in this movement. And that is the set of strategic case making. That's what we do. Next slide, please. So here's our part of the project. We're going to continue to listen to stakeholders of all kinds. Been listening to practitioners, government officials, investors, partnering agencies, and probably most importantly, we're going to listen closely to the folks that this is going to impact the most, community. We're going to listen to help those will-building challenges that you're facing and listen for the successes that you're having. Then we're going to working on a set of tools that will help launch your case making practice. We will share the strategic framework of case making and how to actually apply it to the work that you're doing. We're also hoping to provide some coaching and training. So when you get these resources, you're actually able to deploy them and become an expert case maker for community abundance. We're really excited about this journey. We're excited to walk alongside these partners to not only give you the blueprint for how to either amplify or start more community ownership models, but to actually make the case to folks that you really need and perhaps folks that you didn't even know you needed and really grow a movement. So we invite you to learn more about us at thecaseme.com and also follow this project more. We will definitely be providing updates through this project and amplifying the incredible work that's happening here. So that's the case made, and I will pass it on to our friends at Transform Finance.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks everybody. So glad to be here and be a part of this amazing group of folks doing some really important work. And, it's really all about supporting the folks who are in the participant room here. So yeah, I'm really hoping this is kind of the start to some conversations that we can all have together. So quick background on Transform Finance for those who haven't come across us before. We're a nonprofit that works to create insights and strategies for all of the different stakeholders in the capital ecosystem. So not just investors, but also funders, community leaders who are building new financial models, researchers who are trying to understand the state of the capital ecosystem and what needs to change. So we work with all these stakeholders to really try to challenge the existing paradigms in finance and see new transformative models that really focus on shifting power and equity. So we have three principles that kind of guide all of our work. And those are that those affected by capital have the chance to design outcomes, govern processes, and share in the ownership. Investors add more value than what they extract as returns, and that risk and returns are fairly allocated among all the stakeholders relevant to that investment. So right now, a lot of that work that we've been doing over the past several years is around this kind of idea of ownership, shifting wealth and control. We've done a lot of work with looking at place-based investments that have governance models that invite residents and nonprofit organizations into engagement with capital. So like community capital funds, some really innovative community development models. And we've also been doing a lot of work to build out the capital markets for employee ownership, different types of employee ownership, and figure out how to, unlock new sources of capital. And with this initiative, we are really kind of applying the same kind of processes to this community-owned real estate world. Next slide. So before I get into what exactly we're looking at, I think it may be helpful to contextualize some of the key challenges that the field sees in terms of capital. And I know there's probably a big range of familiarity with these challenges and some of the terminology. So this is pretty high level, and we're happy to get into it later on or offline. So first, the economics are different for community-owned real estate. There's if projects have a focus on affordability, investments have a longer time horizon. There's need for grant capital for community organizations to do this work. There are more stakeholders involved when there's community ownership or nonprofits involved with the development and the investment. And all of that leads to usually the need for subsidy and catalytic capital. So I think that's an important thing to name up front that, this is okay. Like this is kind of part of the community development process, but the capital needs to work around those things and support those things. The capital that is hardest to find is often the capital that, from an investor perspective, is seen as the highest risk. So that's long-term loans, pre-development capital, when communities are kind of deciding, what this project is going to look like. So it's kind of further from, that revenue generation through rents or through, different kinds of refinancing. And then permanent financing. So again, like that long-term financing that can help continue through these different phases of the development process. Those are seen as higher risk. The money that communities really want and really need, like philanthropy and catalytic or cheap money, often moves the slowest. And that's a real mismatch because, when we think about acquisitions, when a property hits the market, oftentimes community projects need those types of capital upfront, but it's hard to get, and sometimes those properties, slip out of the community's hands, and the opportunity is lost. A lot of the risk that investors, and that includes, impact investors, lenders, even, some community investors. A lot of the risks perceived come from the complexity, like, lack of familiarity with these models. So there's kind of an awareness that needs to happen. And then lastly, this is kind of an emerging capital market. There's a lot of infrastructure that is not developed, or at least community-owned real estate investments have not yet been able to really tap into existing community development markets. So a lot of folks are thinking about, okay, how can products be developed that unlock new types of capital? How do we tap into existing government sources of capital? These are ongoing questions. Next slide. So these are some of the questions that we're asking as part of this project. How are capital stacks constructed, and how do they different depending on what community ownership model or what underlying asset it is? Like if you think of commercial properties or corridors or mixed use or a housing of different types. And for this, we're talking to both the project side and the capital side to understand. We are actually just releasing a survey for projects to kind of understand some of these capital stack constructions. So I'll share a link for that later on. We're asking about the processes. How do projects do this fundraising process? What kind of ingredients are necessary to tap into the resources in a community or at the national or regional level? What roles do different types of capital providers play? What would help unlock them? What would help motivate them to support this work? And then lastly, what are these important capital gaps and what are the solutions to these problems? So we are really, just amazed in the research that we've been doing at the creativity in getting around some of these capital issues. And our hope is that over time, we don't have to be so creative and it becomes, easier to kind of get those processes for capital deployment. So next slide. So we're planning to support really the entire field. We're hoping that a lot of the resources we develop are going to be useful for folks in all different camps in terms of stakeholders. So for sure, project teams and community leaders who are developing this work, helping to understand, basic processes around capital development, what's worked, what have other communities done, really lifting up case studies. Similarly for lenders, how a big need is to, help lenders rethink that concept of risk and, kind of break down the different economics of different types of community real estate projects to make them feel more comfortable, engaging if they haven't already. Similar process with philanthropy. There's as mentioned, a really big need for capacity building support and other kinds of grant needs in these projects. At the national level, we really want to see how we can tap into some of the impact capital that have supported other emerging impact fields like high net worth individuals, family offices, also foundations at the national level, and then the broader field. So we'll be, putting out resources that, I hope others find uses that we didn't even think about. And that's, really in collaboration with all the other partners on the panel today. Yeah, I'll end there.
Hi there, good to be with everyone. My name is Leo Goldberg. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm working with Miriam Zook and Groundworks Consulting. Groundworks works as facilitators and researchers to build inclusive community development systems. And on this project, we are focused in on the policy aspect of the community ownership field, and specifically the policies that community ownership advocates and practitioners are using to lay the groundwork to grow the field, to be able to do more projects, and to transform the policy environment to one that's easier to work with for cooperatives and CLTs and land back efforts and all the work that you all are doing. So we know, there's kind of a difficult context at the moment. We know that some of the main federal tools to support housing development and development more generally are not well suited to community ownership. So, that often cited example is the low-income housing tax credit, the biggest tool for supporting affordable housing, doesn't work for most cooperative and community land trust projects. And then coming down to the state and local level, we have another set of policies that also often don't mesh well with community ownership projects. They don't allow for shared equity home ownership arrangements. They don't allow for ground leases. They don't work for cooperative structures. And then finally, we are pretty sure that substantial resources are not about to arrive from the federal government to support our work. So given that context, we're seeing a lot of creativity and energy right now around changing this policy environment, particularly at the state and local level, where groups of community ownership advocates can have some impact. So we've been talking to a lot of folks, learning a lot, and really focusing in on how advocates are identifying policy goals, how they're building campaigns, and then how they are sustaining and supporting implementation after they win policies. So we can go to the next slide. So the questions that are kind of arising from this work and that we're focusing in on are specifically around the kind of strategic coalition building that community ownership advocates are doing to build both, build towards winning policy goals, but also building power and educating the public along the way. We're also looking at how advocates are sequencing campaigns, identifying priorities on the way to bigger kind of policy goals, and building advocacy infrastructure to support these campaigns. So we know there's a lot of momentum around formalizing coalitions, especially in the community land trust space, regional, statewide coalitions to support this work. A lot of interest in fundraising to support policy work and lobbying. And we think that there's a lot there to look at. We're also, really interested in this idea that it's key to cultivate champions within government bureaucracies, whether it's at the state or local level, as well as with elected officials in order to win these policy gains and to sustain them. And then on the sustaining them piece, there's a bunch of strategies being put in place by practitioners right now to try to make sure that government actually implements policy wins effectively. We can go next slide. So to understand this all, we've been talking to advocates and practitioners around the country. We're learning a lot from these coalitions, whether formal or informal, among community ownership practitioners. Also talking to technical assistance providers, scholars, individual community ownership groups who have policy work, policy campaigns. And we're kind of understanding the whole scope of policy work, which includes things like state tax legislation to make sure your projects are being assessed correctly, to public lands policies, Opportunity to Purchase Act, and then also revenue measures to fund the work, campaigns to create government programs to support community ownership projects. We can go to the next slide. And where we're taking this is to develop a set of resources that will focus in on supporting practitioners with building effective campaigns. What are the different kind of puzzle pieces that go into effective community ownership campaigns? Part of that is growing effective coalitions, bringing in allies often from outside of the community ownership field, but sometimes also strengthening relationships between folks doing mobile home park co-ops and CLTs or land bank projects and cooperatives, et cetera. And then how advocates can work with government or put pressure on government to ensure that after the big policy win, there isn't retrenchment, that these policies are implemented effectively, that the funding that's promised actually is delivered on the ground. So with that, I'll pass it to the COSA team.
Thank you, Leo. So, Usman, do you want to share about the website and things?
Oh no, that's the towards the end, Paul.
Oh, okay. Oh, right. Yeah. Before we, before we jump into that, sorry, we do have some time for questions. And so thank you for all the questions you've been adding to the thread. So I wanted to start just with a few questions for the panelists, and specifically for Mariel and Ahmed. Why is community ownership important right now? Like, why is this, do you think, such a pressing issue for our time?
Can kick us off. I think we can all take a step back and look at the state of the world that we're in right now. I'll give an example in my community. So I live in Kansas, and something that was unfortunately just passed by our state house was to defund our matching LIHTC funds. So we are looking at that particular pathway as slowly deteriorating and slowly becoming a non-viable option. But I think this moment is also primed for innovation, and every group that we have listened to so far so firmly believes that community ownership and stewardship is the way forward. Y'all are truly like futurists thinking about how we can move away from, this fully commodified practice of housing and ownership and move more into a community space. So I think we're primed in a moment where things feel like, they're spiraling. Programming that we've relied on, assistance we've relied on for a long time, is no longer the case. If so, what is our world building mechanisms for the future that we need? And I think going back to how community and shared stewardship, which is not a new principle, we quoted indigenous practitioners, indigenous people. They are land stewards. This is a practice that is generational that we can bring back in a really strong way. And I think these particular models can help us get there. So I can see no better moment for this.
Yeah. So I think similarly, I'm glad Mariel brought up the point again that, these aren't necessarily new practices, maybe perhaps the way that we finance and structure them and resource them, maybe. But, so it's almost like the why now question is why not always. But there is, I think, something unique in terms of thinking about this moment, where, we've lost so much faith in the state and government. There's so much distrust, I think, of the corporate sector. And on the flip side, right, we've seen how this year, our movement organizations are under attack. The nonprofit sector is being defunded in such a large way. And in an environment where the sort of large working class organizations of the past that once were a buffer between people and the market are not with us anymore, right? They've been systematically dismantled. And so I think, this notion that communities are very much left in many instances to navigate the economy alone and in a climate of fear, right now we're seeing a state that punishes and doesn't protect, or that doubts science, or where democracy feels more fragile every day. I think it's important to turn to community ownership in this context of a sort of antisocial economy that we exist in. And I think a lot of us have similar sentiments, perhaps, and are doubtful of what we call, or what some folks may call, a free market. When in essence, what's so free about, being able to just kind of take what folks build together, right? The culture, the trust, and the shared places that make our neighborhoods home, and just flip it and sell it back to us at a premium, right? I mean, this is in a context where more than half of the world's wealth is tied up in real estate. So it's, when I think about community ownership, it's making that economy social again. And real people taking control of real local assets, residential land, commercial spaces, what have you, so they can stay put, so they can thrive at home, where they currently are. And of course, community ownerships, whether we're talking about housing co-ops, community land trusts, investment co-ops, whatever model we're talking about, expand access to home ownership, expand access to economic wealth, definitely. But it also recognizes that the wealth that communities already generate, the relationships, the labor that it takes to create our communities, and care that it takes to sustain our communities, the recognition of that wealth is part of what I see tied up in community ownership, right? That's the wealth that glues our communities together. I think, when I think why now, it's like, well, why not take the opportunity for our communities to shape markets and not be shaped by them, right? And bring democracy into everyday life and build power and legacies for tomorrow.
Thank you. Thank you both. I have a question for Kurt and Leo. What trends or common threads do you see emerging as you research? So where do you see the field sort of heading? And both of you I know you're researching the financial and the policy. So
Yeah, I can jump in first. Yeah, I mean a number of things. One thing I kind of noted on earlier, but that really stands out is the kind of creativity in relationship building and alliance making that we're seeing, where I think a lot of community ownership organizations, a lot are coming from the grassroots and don't necessarily have a lot of political heft, and are doing some really interesting strategic work in building out coalitions and alliances with other groups. And some of it's, in the housing space, which makes sense. So we're seeing partnerships with Habitat for Humanity affiliates or tenant organizers in many cases, EMB groups in some cases, but also folks bringing in organized labor and environmental justice advocates and other groups really from other sectors to build up their political power, and also I think helps with educating a broader public and decision makers. So that's one thing. It's something we want to kind of understand more and learn how people are being effective at bringing in some of these other stakeholders. And then the other piece, we've saw some really big policy wins where community ownership coalitions, individual groups, groups of advocates were able to win new funding sources over the last few years, especially with the kind of COVID era federal infusions of money. There were some really creative new policies and programs that were able to use ARPA funds. In many cases, those have been rolled back or are under threat right now, right? We have a number of kind of exciting city or statewide trust funds that were specifically designed to serve cooperative CLTs, et cetera, and then now at risk of being cut. In some cases, it was because of kind of bureaucracies that were unable to move money or implement policies quickly. Other cases because of change in elected office holders, right? The winds change and new executives are less excited about community ownership. But regardless, I think it's kind of a moment to take stock on, how do we keep these programs going after the win and learn from some cases where advocates have stayed mobilized and continue to put pressure on elected officials, and trying to lift up those practices.
Yeah, thanks, Leo. Yeah, I can talk a little bit from the capital side. First, I think, in terms of trends, it is really, really amazing just over the past 5-10 years to see how many unique approaches and models have emerged in the community ownership space. And on one hand, it's beautiful, and on the other hand, part of why there's so much happening in this space is that communities on the ground, housing organizers, neighborhood organizations, tenants are seeing all of these gaps, and the infrastructure and models to fill those gaps just doesn't exist. So a lot of this stuff is just getting built from the ground up through a lot of experimentations, and that's both on the like legal structural governance side, but on the capital side too. What does it look like to have a portfolio of projects that is completely controlled by community members, and has a community investment component where residents can buy small shares for $50 and see some of that value that they get from their own community. These are new-ish concepts, and a lot of these concepts are being combined. And so the capital coming in and the revenue models, the mix of different buckets, the philanthropy, debt, equity, and different types of those products are really kind of in emergence. So I think a trend is really that we need to see what is working out of all of these models and support the communities on the ground to make sure that their visions can succeed, because a lot of these strategies can be replicated in other places. And from the funder and investor side, I think, and this is a key network and audience for Transform Finance. It's important to note that ownership right now is kind of a hot topic. And, there's a lot of folks here know that, philanthropy and impact investing goes through a lot of waves or phases. And sometimes something can be really hot and there's a lot of funding. And then the next moment, we switch to something else. And right now, for better or worse, there's a really big focus on wealth, community ownership, because for me, I think it's because it's this intersection of, kind of capital market solutions, thinking about, home ownership as, American dream, and there's been so much wealth created through home ownership. How do we figure out how to share that? And so importantly, I think a trend that I'm seeing from kind of the narrative around the impact here is that there is kind of a big tent and potential tensions between, a real focus on wealth building models, so like that kind of like equity sharing, and then the power building approaches, the long-term affordability approaches that are really thinking about real estate completely differently. I think Ahmed framed a lot of this really well. It's like it's coming into contact with capital markets that are just built for totally different approaches to living and to creating built environments. So when we think about this big tent that's being created at the national level from funders and investors, I think we really need to create clarity and have like robust conversations around what kind of capital, what kind of impact can we expect for different models that actually have very different kind of theories of change or goals for the communities that are creating those models. For me, I think, well, one note that I will end this on in terms of trends is where I'm hoping this interest goes is long-term sustainability and creating avenues of permanent support for community leaders that want to create community ownership and in their place. So I think one way that we're seeing a little bit that I'm hoping really continues is opportunities for conversation and collaboration between philanthropy and impact investors. So thinking about like family offices or values aligned high net worth individuals to work with the CDFI space, the community development space, folks that have been doing affordable housing lending and investing for many years. And that combination could actually lead to a long-term shift in practices in the community development space if it's done really intentionally. There's a lot of mindsets and paradigms that need to change if we are to really make this a backbone of communities, for the long term, particularly around how investment folks are taught about risk, how they, have checklists they have to maintain for, kind of these arbitrary top-down approaches that are kind of taught in business school and urban planning school. There's a real need for a breaking of some of these like underlying paradigms in the capital markets. But I'm hoping that this new influx of interest and particularly capital coming from, or that wants to come from the national level, can help spur that conversation. And it's really important that projects and community leaders are able to guide, how that ultimately shapes up.
Okay, so we have time for one more question I'm going to lift up. And this is thank you, Jonathan, for your support. But essentially, in the chat, through several different questions, there's like a theme about skepticism on using any established investors for this work, given that their model is to extract more money, more capital than they put in. So even CDFIs are structured this way. They're influenced by big banks that fund them through the CRA. They often require, an 8% return. Are there any non-extractive or virtually non-extractive funders or models or financiers that this group thinks holds promise? Or do we need to just use existing funding and financing sources more innovatively than we have been?
I'm happy to do a quick answer, but I also want to hear from other folks. That skepticism is totally warranted, and going back to shifting risks and perceptions and paradigms in the community development space, there's a real need because I think these projects are less risky than are being assessed, from the underwriters, from the capital providers. But these institutions are difficult to shift. It's a long-term process. There's a lot of organizing in the community development world that needs to happen in order to, kind of help them along. And what we're seeing is the way that a lot of these projects are being funded is through a blend of philanthropy and what I would say non-extractive capital, very low interest loans. Some of those are coming from donor advised funds. Some of them are coming from community foundations. We need to unlock more of those sources because the presence of that cheaper money brings CDFIs and more traditional lenders to the table. And I think without that, there's no exposure and there's not going to be kind of evolution in that space to continue funding these in the long term. And I think we need to also just consider that, affordable housing would not work in a pure market economy without subsidy and legislation and regulation that provides advantages and incentives. We need to think about, how to make sure that those apply to community ownership or build new types of those regulations through organizing.
I just want to plus one the organizing part, right? We really need to think about, not to use case making, but we really have to make the case for what are the current levers that we could use, what's in front of us that's viable, and how are we slowly doing that culture shift of, our financing as it is now and the building as it is now may not be the future we're going to see. So how are we making that really strong case to folks and figuring out who are the ones we can start moving in that direction? I think that is really making the case for a lot of the best practices and conversations and growth that is happening in a lot of these projects and showing people, showing these investors, showing people with capital, this is the single best investment you can make right now. So it is going to take some organizing power and some really, really hard learned skill sets and strategies. And I hope that what we accomplish in this project can start providing resources to all to start thinking and deploying some of those skills.
And I know we're short on time, but I think thinking expansively about advocacy is a lot of what I hear in these answers as well. And I think that's really important. That's something we see pretty frequently in the space. It's like, advocacy isn't necessarily limited to public sector actors, right? Like, how can we advocate among financial sector actors? And I think, one example I look to that's very good is say like a shared capital, right? They're CDFI, they're a lender for co-ops, does a very excellent job of helping educate other lenders that are coming in on deals. So it's also like how we ourselves as folks who are acting in this field continue to spread education around this, right? To just kind of double click on the points that Kurt and Mariel are making.
Thank you all so much. I want to pass it on to Osman to wrap us up and to share a few more follow-up opportunities. I know people have been asking, like, how can they get more involved?
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul. As I remove everyone's spotlight and add my own, just wanted to quickly share some next steps and resources. So what I'm seeing a lot in the chat and in the Q&A is a sharing of resources, reports, funds, case studies. And I would like to point you all to a website that we have created, the COSA team that Paul described earlier, called Community Field Notes. Community Field Notes, the address is futureby.community. And Paul is going to be dropping that link into the chat. On this website, it's a community source hub for information, resources, and a place for networking with other allies. All these resources that you are sharing here, please submit them to the website. We have an ongoing list of reports, resources, webinars that are on the website, as well as an interactive map of the different community ownership projects that we're seeing throughout the country. Please submit yours. We update the website and and the map very frequently. There's also, the website is where we'll feature a lot of the work that's coming out of this project, the Cola Lab. So please stay tuned and please join the website and use the community. Another big resource that I want to talk to you about is the high-low community of practice that we have created at the website. We're going to show a QR code on the next slide where you can join by your phone, but Paul is also going to be dropping a link in the chat to join this community of practice. And this is exactly the kind of space that we want to cultivate more of, what's happening in the chat. It is a place to share resources, answer each other's questions. We will be updating everyone via the high-low community. There'll be bi-weekly newsletters being sent around new and exciting opportunities and resources that are coming up. The information that comes out of the COLA project will also be featured through the high-low as well. But really what we want it to be is an organic space where folks are asking questions, networking, sharing information, and really supporting this emerging field and each other, and really creating a big online community of practice. Finally, I'm just going to close on next steps. Like I said, if you want to join the high-low community by your phone, please click on that QR link and keep an eye out. We will be emailing you all follow-up, the slides that we presented today, but also all the questions that we have yet to answer in the chat will be uploaded in the high-low, and all the panelists and other community members will have an opportunity to answer those questions and go more into detail in the online community of practice. We will also be having a full roster of webinars, open office hours on the online community of practice sessions coming up, which will feature all the research and products that are being created by the partners that just talked today, and also any other resources that we can find throughout the year. So please join the community. That's the big space for us to be connected with you and you all to be connected with each other. This webinar will also be uploaded into the website shortly, so keep an eye out for that. And with that, I'm just going to close out the webinar itself and see, Paul, you have any last thoughts to share.
Just thank you all for such a dynamic, exciting conversation in the chat, all of your questions. We look forward to continuing the conversation on high-low, and we're really grateful for your time today. We will be in touch. So thank you.
Thank you, folks. Really appreciate your time.